Nigeria's oil sector stands at a pivotal juncture, requiring strategic recalibration in light of booming global profits. Key areas for transformation include financial agility, active market engagement, strategic petroleum reserves, greener policies, and balancing global dynamics. The issue around pump price is probably the singular most important issue for a society that is built on a hydrocarbon. So it doesn't matter who you are, super rich, middle class, poor, or even destitute, everyone is feeling the pinch. So many are calling for a new thinking, a new approach when it comes to Nigeria's oil sector. My guest is the founder, Petroleum Resource. He's one of those who has worked across the continent in oil and gas in many, many different countries across Africa. An international entrepreneur, investor, and businessman, Michael Press joins me now to look at rethinking Nigeria's approach to the oil sector. Mr. Press, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So we're looking at a different approach for Nigeria's oil sector, and we've seen something very different in the past 1 to 2 weeks. And I know that was breaking news we discussed off air. So let's bring that conversation here. And that's, of course, the announcement by the NNPC Limited that it had secured a $3 billion emergency loan. So this is an emergency crude oil repayment loan from the Afri-Exim Bank. And so they say the main benefits is that this loan will assist the NNPC Limited to settle taxes and royalties in advance, and also help the federal government with the necessary dollar liquidity to stabilize the naira. $3 billion loan is not a crude for refined product swap, but an upfront cash loan against proceeds from a limited amount of future crude oil production. But there are questions that are tied to this, again, in terms of possible overreach or whatnot. But let's look at it in terms of a different approach. So what do you think of this approach that seems to be coming from the Tinubu administration?
Well, firstly, I think you need to congratulate Afri-Exim Bank for stepping in at this time, and also to congratulate NNPC Limited and the Minister of Finance, and holds a dual role, Minister of Finance and Coordinator of the Economy. The reason why I say that is that much has been said about this transaction, but what is the transaction? The natural consequence of the transaction are those points that you've raised in the sense of providing liquidity today, and the impact of that liquidity has had a positive impact in the context of the naira exchange rate. But what NNPC has done and what Afri-Exim Bank has stepped in to prove is that Nigeria PLC as a country per se is investable. It's about structuring, and it's about how you put the transaction together. So people should not lose sight of that. It's also positive in the sense that it begins to give you a flavor of how the new administration is thinking in the context that let's explore, let's try every avenue, let's not sit back, let's be proactive, and let's see how we can solve the current issues. So I urge everybody, I don't know the exact details of the transaction line by line, but in overview, it seems it's a transaction that leverages off future tax and royalty payments of, I think, 5 to 6 PSCs, and it guarantees dedicated offtake. I mean, that's how it is in simple structure. But the positive thing that you should take away from that is that it's now underpinned and underlines a desire to be an active participant in the global market from a financial aspect, and use those to leverage near-term issues. And we have some near-term issues, particularly as regards the stability of the exchange rate, and also as regards the stability of the pump price. So in answering your question, that's how I view it. And I don't think people should necessarily see it I mean, a lot of things has been said in papers recently. I don't know how much of what has been said has been based on the actual document that has been signed or is privy to, available or privy to those who have signed it. That document hasn't been, I'm not privy to that, but in overview, I understand the transaction very, very well.
Okay, so I want to stick with this transaction because a lot of questions have been raised about the parts of the loan, which is also to provide the government with needed dollar liquidity to stabilize the naira. That's also part of what the NNPC itself included in its press release. So there are questions about how this loan is coming through the NNPC and how the NNPC is meant to accomplish this stabilization of the naira. There have been articles now coming out and people think pieces, basically asking, are we seeing an NNPC of everything? So Michael, do you think that this is a potential overstep from the NNPC, or given the limits and the restructuring and the potential that the company has, it's well within certain tenets, or it's well within its rights to actually work towards the stabilization of the naira, especially through this kind of loan agreement?
Well, NNPC today is a creature of PIB. Sections, I think it's 64 of the PIB tell you what NNPCs functions should be, objectives are, and what it should achieve. I think it's A, C, I, and M. And in M, subsection M of that, section 64, it really does point to what NNPC is trying to achieve. I think perhaps it was unfortunate the way the transaction was described, because as I said in answering your first question, the natural consequence of the transaction is to achieve that. But I don't think that should be seen as the driver of the transaction. Rather, the driver of the transaction is a willingness to be proactive, particularly in the context of a market or markets that still have faith in Nigeria, and Nigeria's ability to leverage forward revenues based upon specific structures. I mean, Afreximbank did an admirable thing because they demonstrated to the world that yes, there is still elements of what we have that you can leverage off to the benefit of Nigeria as a whole. So it's a nuance in what you say, but I don't think that's what drove the transaction. I think that's what is a natural consequence of the transaction. So your second question, whether you think this is I think you asked me whether it's an overreach on the part of NNPC. I mean, that's a difficult question to answer because the two shareholders of NNPC are the Minister of Petroleum and the Minister of Finance, and now Minister of Finance and Coordinating Economy. NNPC's role is twofold. One, or at least I think it should be twofold. One, it should be to focus on increasing our production, particularly in what has been a dynamic, but also using its pivotal position in coordination with the Ministry of Finance to see how you can better marry those two positions to address what are in effect issues that are at the table of the Ministry of Finance.
All right, so it's playing a dynamic role. It has basically what we talk about in the organograms, like two reporting lines, and it must also, in terms of those reporting structures, be able to deliver for them. So let's stay on this NNPC situation, particularly as it pertains to the dynamic oil markets we've seen in recent times. Now, there was a low for international crude oil prices in April 2020. That was about $20.65. And by June 2022, we've seen crude oil go to $119, 14 cents on the international market. That was about a 500% increase. So from 2021 to 2022 and now into 2023, we've seen some interesting returns for oil producers and other companies. But when we come to this, in terms of Nigeria as a sovereign oil producer and a member of OPEC, the country has not been able to benefit. We haven't been able to benefit in the way the likes of Vital, Glencore, Saudi Aramco have also been able to benefit, making absolutely astounding amounts of profits because of the international situation. So before we look at a solution, Michael, I think it doesn't hurt us to continue to again focus on the loss here. Why did Africa's largest crude oil producer struggle to make money when we've seen international oil companies that are also owned by countries making record profits? A lot of people have described this as opportunity loss. You yourself have described it as an opportunity loss.
Well, you know, it's a difficult question to answer because you can't go backwards. Yes, it was an opportunity loss, primarily because I don't think we were set up to participate in the uplift. And I know when I say that, you think, well, that's quite glib. But that's, in essence, the issue that was at hand. To participate in the upside of a market, you have to be fully present in that market. And I don't think enough attention had been spent on addressing that side of the equation. Most of the past between that period had been focused upon reacting to the pump price, reacting to issues, and yet not enough time or structures put in place to be active participants in a market. And when I say a market, I just don't mean a physical market, but I also mean the financial side of that market, or some would say the future side of that market. But all these tools are available, but you need to be a participant in order to enjoy the benefits that come from the same. So some of the names you mentioned are some of the world's preeminent crude oil traders, and that's their day-to-day job. You mentioned Saudi Aramco, and I believe you mentioned another producer. Yes, Saudi Aramco has been set up to act both as a quasi-commercial entity and also representative of the state. We can't change what has happened in the past, but I'm confident that with the current Minister of Finance, particularly, and the way that now we have an infant, which is the product of the PIB, and it has a specific mandate, then my prayer is that the marriage of those two positions should ensure that we set up the right structures such that if the price of crude oil remains at these levels, or perhaps there's a spike because of whatever exogenous shocks in terms of demand and supply, we are able to participate and enjoy that benefit, as well as some of the names that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very important. It's very, very important that, and this be understood, we need to start participating meaningfully across the value chain in the oil markets, not simply sit back and see our role as that we produce, we sell on an FOB basis, or sometimes in terms of the higher parts of the complex on a CIF basis. But that's not where the job ends. That the job post-sale, being able to leverage the benefits post-FOB are available to us, and we need to set up those required structures so we can ensure the benefit. Be clear, the shareholders of NNPCL are the Minister of Finance as well as the Minister of Petroleum, but in effect, they're holding those positions on trust for the rest of the nation. So there's an incumbent duty to ensure that they extract the absolute maximum value for every molecule of a hydrocarbon that leaves this country. I'm confident, given the choice of the Minister of Finance, I don't know the Minister of Petroleum, but I'd like to think that the combination of the two are such that people begin to understand that it is a necessary function that NNPC better coordinates with the Ministry of Finance and is better brought into policy-making decisions as they regards the economy. Because as of today, our number one value creator is that hydrocarbon, crude oil.
Okay, so Michael, you've mentioned it here, and it was also in a presentation you put together in terms of Nigeria being fully present on the market as well, to make sure that we're focusing on extracting the actual implied and trading value that is embedded in any hydrocarbon that is sold. In terms of how that would work, I think you've touched a bit on that, but I want you to combine your answer to this next question. How does that work? Having a Nigeria that's fully present in the markets, being able to actively and deliberately trade and also participate in these markets, and again establish a strategic petroleum reserve. That's something you've also been a very big advocate of. So walk us through how you think that would work, and how this strategic petroleum reserve would also come into the picture in terms of ensuring some kind of stability for Nigeria's pump price and also possibly revenue too.
Well, let's take the second part first. What I actually said, and there's a distinction, I've said I'm in favor of a dynamic strategic reserve, almost based on the South Korean model, whereby it has the strategic reserve has two roles. One is to maximize profits, and whilst also meeting the public interest. So let's not confuse the two. I'm not advocating a static petroleum. I'm not advocating a static petroleum petroleum reserve that does nothing. But what I am advocating is a dynamic petroleum reserve, which seeks also to make money, but also to act as also to step in terms of providing security, but also providing access to required petroleum products, albeit at a time whilst we're waiting for our refining capacity to resume or and increase. So I'm advocating a stopgap measure until we get to that point. As regards to your first question, it's a 24-hour job. It's not something that I can necessarily address easily on one interview on television, but such as we need to mimic, in many respects, what the traders do. We need to ensure that we are active participants in the market. We need to ensure that whether they be derivative products, whether they be futures products, we structure ourselves accordingly, and we allow those such as international financing agencies who can then step in and combine with the NNPC or whoever the body may be to ensure that we are actively ensuring that we get the absolute value from every single hydrocarbon and every single layer of the barrel that we produce.
Mm-hmm. All right, so
we cannot afford to be sedentary.
We cannot afford to be sedentary.
We cannot afford it, particularly at this point in time, as we and why I say this is because I think that the public they don't want to know about the machinations of what we've discussed on a call like this. What they do want to know is that, one, they have access to product. So let me take a step back. The pump price is everybody's bellwether of how, I would say, a government today is doing, because that singular issue affects every aspect of everybody's life. Transportation, food, new school fees for the coming term. Everything is somehow linked to that one issue. So it's not it's more than a pressing issue. It's almost an issue that defines our lives today. Mm. That is why it needs to be tackled, it needs to be solved. And that is why we need to use every single tool available to ensure that we can bring it under control.
Okay, so you talk about this point in time where we are, and I think it's also important in a conversation with someone like yourself to talk about what's also happening globally. So we've seen the West pushing for an energy transition, but it finally seems that the continent too is also pushing back, demanding a just energy transition, putting that just in front of it, demanding justice in this situation, which would allow African countries to make use of their natural resources at their disposal for economic progress. So when we look at this transition and its impact on oil market dynamics, how do you think Nigeria can adapt its approach in order to capitalize on emerging opportunities in the evolving energy landscape? We can't ignore what's happened, and we can't ignore what's coming to us as well, but how do we then prepare for it and have an approach that doesn't leave us, again, holding an empty bag?
If I've understood your question properly, you're referring to an energy transition from a hydrocarbon to renewables. Is that the question you're asking me?
Yes.
So in that transition process, Nigeria should be should be at the front of the queue, because what do we have? We possess a sweet crude oil, as opposed to others who possess a very heavy, sour crude oil. So we should be front and center, actually seeing how we can change, how we can participate in that transition. I don't think, and this is my own personal thought, I don't think you could roll against the tide. Mm. What I do believe, and it goes back to my original point, that participate and then you can affect better outcomes. I don't think we should be throwing our lot in necessarily with other producers who have a heavier, more, for want of a better word, polluting crude oil. But we are blessed in many respects in having a sweet, low sulfur crude oil, and we should better optimize how we utilize that, both in terms of the geography of destination, but also how do we fit into this transition. I don't think you can necessarily say, well, as an African continent, we're going to push against that energy transition, because I think that's, in some respects, the thinking of the dinosaur. But what I do think is that you must be front and center, understanding what role you can play in that transition, because that transition, it's not a question of how. It's just a question of when, but it will come. And if we don't, if we're not realistic enough to accept that will come, then I think the phrase you use, we might end up holding the bag. But I don't want us to do that. I'd rather that Nigeria as a nation focuses on understanding what is its unique USP in the context of the oil markets. And the unique USP that we have is that we have a sweet crude oil, to some extent, which is somewhat more environmentally friendly than other crude hydrocarbons in the world. And that is how we have to position ourselves. So that's also a question of who do we sell to? What are the geographies we go to? Can we improve the product we sell so it falls in line with any environmental inhibitors that are around the world? But to suggest that we can somehow push against what is a natural tide, I don't think that's true.
Okay. All right, Michael, before I let you go, because of time, there's data that's out, and I want you to quickly take a stab at this in about a minute. So the MBS released inflation data recently. Headline inflation jumped to 24.08% in July. Food inflation also moved to 26.98% as well. And although prices of food have been on the rise in Nigeria in recent years, the situation has also deteriorated due to the impact of some government policies, such as the removal of subsidy on petrol. Nigeria must take tough decisions. We've heard that for decades now, particularly regarding the oil and gas sector. When we look at the administration of President Bola Tinubu, he recently made a promise to Nigerians that there would be no reason, with the information in front of him, to change pump prices. But this morning, we're hearing that oil marketers are saying that pump prices must change because the naira is now back to about 920 naira to $1. So in terms of the directional approach we see from the President Tinubu administration, do you think he's headed in the right direction? And can he make the needed, necessary, tough decisions when it comes to rethinking, re-strategizing, recalibrating Nigeria's oil and gas industry?
I think the toughest decision is the decision, and I was asked this question about, I think, 4 or 5 months ago, and my response was that whilst I wasn't in favor of the subsidy as we had for several years, I do believe that it's inescapable at a certain point, unless there's a better marriage of both economic policy in terms of stabilization of naira, and also what I've said across this call about optimizing the value we get from the hydrocarbon we sell. There will be a point of inflection where you may need to introduce a better subsidy. And I know that may appear a little controversial, but I don't think that's something you can avoid. Subsidy has been given a bad name in Nigeria because of the nature of the subsidy we had. But subsidy in principle is not a bad idea in the context that it's an intervention to help across the board, particularly those who are less able. So you have subsidies in the US, you have subsidies in the UK, you have subsidies, and I'm talking about subsidies as they pertain to pump prices. So it's not a new thing. So the difficult decision is, I believe, that 2 things. I don't think you should take subsidy off the table. What I do think you have to better improve the type of subsidy and the type of subsidy structure you have, and ensuring that that subsidy structure is better tailored for both our fiscal requirements and also doesn't result in us, no pun intended, subsidizing the whole West African hinterland. That's where the problem arises. You asked me the question, do I think the current government, what was the word you used? I don't want to misquote you. You asked me the question, how did you frame the last part, please?
Recalibrate and re-strategize the oil sector.
Again, that's a work in progress. Deals such as the Afrexim Bank deal, as presented, are part and parcel of that recalibration. What I mentioned earlier, whereby I would like to see a part of NNPC, I wouldn't say be an extension of the Ministry of Finance, but have a better marriage between the two, so you can implement strategic macro and micro policy.
Okay.
I don't want there to be a divergence between the two. So I think it's early days, but I think steps like that tell you there's a willingness to readdress, to rethink, and to re-engage. Most important, to re-engage. When you re-engage, then you begin to solve problems. Just one point that I must make.
Very quickly, Michael, because of time.
Yeah, we don't control the oil price.
Yes.
Nobody should think that we do. We do not control the oil price. So you have to see yourself in the context of a global market where you don't control the oil price. What you can do, you can use market levels to mitigate against oil price shocks. That is where we need to be. We need to set up structures that allow us, give us the opportunity to think around that process. Sitting back and being passive and just reacting is not the place that we wish to be.
All right.
I think the public would like to see a more stable pump price in the first instance. I kind of marry palliatives to subsidy. It's just a question of nomenclature, but it's
almost the same thing. Yes.
Almost the same.
Yeah. All right, Michael, we have to leave it at that. I do apologize because of time. But as you said, it is the early days, and we're looking to see more details particularly come out concerning the NNPC Limited deal with the Afrexim Bank. Terms and conditions, timelines, those are the things that many of us want to see now and to see what we really gain from this. But there's a lot more to do with the next 4 years and a lot more to do with this administration.
We're seeing positives. We're seeing positive signs, which is a good thing.
All right, so we hope that the positive signs stay and they become more and more realistic for Nigerians. Michael Press, thank you so much for joining me on this this episode of this particular interview here on Business Edge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. And we continue the conversations here. Up next, we're going to be looking at the outcomes of the BRIT Summit that held in Johannesburg, South Africa, but that comes up after the international business headlines.